Welcome back to Liminal Journeys. I'm your host, Easton Sanders. Before we get started on today's episode, I just want to share my appreciation for each of you that's checked out our first episode, which features the true story of a man who lived a lifetime within a dream. I've been very surprised by the response of the podcast so far. While it certainly hasn't gone viral, it has received a lot more attention than I expected for being a brand new podcast. So if you haven't checked out the first episode, I definitely recommend it. It is pretty short, at about 5 minutes long, but it's a very interesting story, and I think it's worth a listen. As always, you can find more information in the description. Today I want to talk about not deer. It's an interesting phenomenon that I've seen pop up several times over the last few years. You might be asking yourself, what are not deer? Well, not deer are creatures or beings that look like deer for the most part, but they're not your typical deer. If you saw one from a distance, you probably wouldn't think anything of it, but seeing one up close is an entirely different story. I've seen a wide array of descriptions, with some indicating the deer appears to have something wrong with it, as if it's confused or sickly. Others say the animal's movements are choppy and unnatural, almost as if the alien that was wearing Edgar's skin in the original Men in Black movie had taken over a deer instead. In more extreme examples, not deer are seen walking on their hind legs, screeching or screaming, or even displaying the teeth of a predator. For others, it can be more of an uncanny valley kind of feeling. Everything appears normal, except maybe the animal's acting a little bit odd, but more importantly, your body is sensing danger. Alarm bells are going off in your mind, telling you to get out of there. They don't seem to have any fear of humans, and they might even approach you, or they might just stare directly at you. Not deer are often associated with Appalachia, but experiences are definitely not limited to Appalachia. While reviewing reports, I noted a pretty even number of them coming from both Appalachia and elsewhere. When people think of not deer, I think a certain viral 4chan post is what comes to mind for a lot of people. If you haven't seen it, the user basically describes how he was out hunting with his grandfather for his birthday when they witnessed a deer slam its head into a rock until its antlers and skull were shattered. He then describes how the deer then stands upright like a human before it walks itself into a river to die. There's certainly no shortage of not deer experiences online, and I've collected a few others from around the web to share with you. This first experience was submitted by user SpookyStoat. This story really stands out to me because the not deer, or whatever these things are, really seems to go out of its way to terrify those that saw it. Here's their story.
Around 4 to 5 years ago, my husband and I were on our way to work. This took place about 6 a.m. He was driving, and I was looking out the passenger window into a cornfield. I caught sight of a deer, but something felt off. It really felt like time slowed down as I watched the deer rise up onto its hind legs. The intense feeling of dread made my stomach turn, and for a second I felt like I was going to vomit. For height reference, the corn had only grown about 5 feet. And the deer was at least 6 feet or more. I noticed its eyes were solid white, its head was straight up, and its front legs just dangled there. The best way to describe what I saw was if you hollowed out a deer and climbed into it. The creepiest thing about it was that it looked like it had a seam that ran under its chin, down its chest, and what looked like a human eye peeking out of the slit. All I could think was, don't make eye contact. I looked away real quick. It all happened in the matter of seconds, but it felt like minutes.
See what I mean? Whatever it is, that thing was working overtime to leave a lasting impression. This next story was submitted by a Redditor that wanted to keep their username private. This story is a little bit different from the others because it features an animal morphing into a deer. And it doesn't end there. He also ties in a strange experience his neighbor had the night before this experience took place with what looked to be a person causing trouble. This story feels a lot like one that came right out of Skinwalker Ranch. Without further ado, here is story number 2. My family has a small farmstead in more or less the middle of nowhere central Texas, to the southeast of Austin. But very rural, all dirt roads, only a couple of neighbors within a mile or so. I usually walk with my dog in the thick woods on our property, but sometimes we walk along the dirt roads because it's like we have them to ourselves. Yesterday, we were walking along the dirt road back towards home when we heard something crash in the woods off to our left. I looked closely, but I didn't see anything and just figured it was an animal or a branch falling. No biggie. A few more steps and 2 coyotes burst out of the woods and crossed the road right in front of us. This is weird because it's late in the day for coyotes to be active, but more so because they look huge for coyotes, almost wolf size, and one of them looks kind of hunched over like it's hurt, or a bipedal animal loping along on all fours for some reason. These big, possibly injured coyotes run into the brush on the other side of the road. My dog and I kind of stand there for a bit, but then move on. It's the country. There's going to be coyotes, whatever. We round a corner, and here comes one of the coyotes crossing the road again, fast. It scoots under the fence, and I watch it run across the pasture past some cattle who are totally unbothered by this large predator running by them. I call my dog back to me because I know the second one is probably about to pop out, and I don't want her getting into a fight. Here's where it gets a little weird. Sure enough, out runs the second one. It's the hunched-over and injured-looking one. It hits the fence line where there's a bit of low, scrubby brush. I wait for it to pop out of the other side and start watching to see how these cows are going to react. But it doesn't come out. It kind of just disappears into the tiny patch of brush, which doesn't seem at all big or dense enough to conceal it. We slowly move closer to the fence and brush to see if this coyote is hurt or hung up on the fence or something. All of a sudden, one of the biggest, most majestic bucks I've ever seen around here pops out of the fence line and runs into the field. Its antlers are huge, and he's taller and more masculine than most of our central Texas deer. He runs along a bit, then just turns and watches us. We go closer to the fence to see what's up with this coyote, but there's no coyote, and absolutely nowhere a coyote could have hid. The deer is still watching us, and I don't know what to do, so I just shout, "Good morning," and say something like, "We mean you no harm," and walked home. The evening just prior to this morning's walk with the deer and coyote, our closest neighbor, maybe a fourth of a mile away, was in his pool with his family when some dude comes up to the fence line of his property and starts climbing the fence. The neighbor sends his family inside and grabs a pistol. He goes out and confronts the guy, who is now running toward the house from the tree line, having successfully jumped the barbed wire fence. The dude's filthy and absolutely covered in blood, and he says, "Oh, thank God you've got a gun. I was digging for gold and they found me, and they're coming for me through the woods. Call the cops," which the neighbor thinks is actually a great idea. Mind you, there's never been any gold mining around here whatsoever. Oil some, but no gold. So you're probably thinking meth, and indeed, when the sheriff's deputy shows up, he says, "Sir, do you ever do any drugs?" And the dude from the woods is like, "Yeah, meth. Did some yesterday." And the deputy says, "Okay, well, sir, do you think maybe that's got something to do with the fact that you're here on this gentleman's property right now?" It was probably to definitely meth, But one weird thing is that supposedly there was this old hermit dude that lived out here in the 30s and didn't trust anyone, so he buried his gold in the same woods this guy came out of, supposedly being chased by this mysterious group of them. And then the coyote to deer thing happens maybe a half-mile away, less than 12 hours later. Like I said, this is something I could totally see happening in Skinwalker Ranch. That does lead me to wonder if there's something similar going on in this Redditor's neck of the woods. Either way, this is very unique and very weird. The next story comes from Slow Fault, who claims they were chased by a not deer, which is just about as terrifying as it gets. A friend of theirs also ponders if nature spirits could be the cause. This story takes place in 2008 in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, if you're familiar with Charlottesville, the story takes place outside city limits in the county near Old Lynchburg Road before all the student apartments were completed. At the time, I lived in Fry Springs on Sunset in a townhouse, and my roommate was using my vehicle. I was with my friend at the house. So I decided to walk to the corner store to get some smokes. If you follow the trail in the backyard, it's a beautiful walk and a little quicker than driving around the windy roads. It wasn't dark yet, but the sun was going down, and it was cooling off into a beautiful evening. So I ask my friend Jay if they want anything and head off onto the trail that brings you out behind the country store. At first, my walk down the trail was just like any other. There were birds chirping, animal noises, and a nice breeze. When I got to the split in the trail, for some reason I began to feel very uneasy. My hair was standing on end. I felt like I was being watched, and I felt that heavy feeling in my stomach. But I walked this trail many times, and it wasn't that much further. That's when I started to hear crunching leaves and snapping twigs near me. I quickly scanned the area and was relieved when I spotted a large buck standing off the trail, partly behind a sycamore tree. First thing that struck me was the rack on this deer. The antlers were super thick and burly, more like moose antlers, but not quite moose antlers. It just looked off. I decided to keep walking and noticed when I started walking, so did the deer. So I walked a little faster, and so did the deer. I stopped, and this deer took off in a full-blown sprint. Something about the way this thing moved was just so unnatural. Almost like a rocking horse, and its hind legs were in reverse of how they were supposed to be. It was very unsettling and prompted me to bust out in a full-blown sprint to the end of the trail. I'm running down this trail being fueled by some form of primal fear when I come around the bend, and there in the middle of the trail is the not deer. I started trying to backpedal and fell down. On the ground, I'm just looking at the thing, and it hits me. This thing is a predator. It's got front-facing eyes. Deer don't have front-facing eyes. But that's not all that's wrong with it. Its face is not right. It's too round, and it's got huge jowls, and its mouth is far too rounded to be a deer. The snout is far too short. So much is wrong. I scrambled to get to my feet, but whatever this thing was decided to stand on its hind legs when I stood up. I don't know if it thought I was challenging it because it stood up on its hind legs, and it was huge. It towered over me. It had to have been 8 feet tall. I turned around and started running as fast as I could, but I could hear the sounds of a bipedal stride close behind me. I never turned around. I was sure if I turned around, it would get me. When I reached the fork in the trail, I could no longer hear it behind me. When I got out of the woods, I started screaming like a maniac. So much so that my friend Jay came out at the back door with a shotgun. I should mention my friend Jay is a backwoods mountain boy from Cripple Creek, and he has a lot of native blood in his family. When I finally calmed down enough to explain what happened, Jay told me that was no deer. He said in the woods there are a lot of things regular people don't know about, and what I encountered was one of those other things. He said it was up to something, and I disturbed it. The gist of what I got is that it's some sort of manifestation of a forest spirit that seems similar to an Eastern European leshy. Well, I certainly don't disagree with his friend. I do think there are a lot of things out there that we just don't understand. In our last story, user Morfosi shares a strange experience they had with something they're assuming was a deer. Interestingly enough, as creepy as this encounter is, Morfosi shared that they would be relieved to find out it was a deer rather than something else. I live in Virginia, in a pretty rural area. My house is a townhome in a neighborhood right next to a middle school. I've lived in this house for over 10 years and frequently went on walks during the daytime all around the neighborhood itself, plus the surrounding buildings and woods. But I've never gone on a walk at night here. After starting college, I got very accustomed to taking walks around my campus at night when the weather's nice. So now that I'm home for winter break and Virginia's in one of its weirdly warm winter weeks, I decided I might as well go on a walk at night here, since it's a safe area and night walks are an almost daily routine for me now. So I leave my house at around midnight, not very late. I walk over to the middle school and I sit down on the track. The track is a concrete oval going around the soccer field. I'm just sitting there relaxing and listening to music with one earbud in. I also had a lit candle on the ground a foot in front of me, which sounds kind of weird of me to have now that I type it out. Lighting candles while I sit and chill somewhere outside is just a habit I've developed from having a ton of candles and being unable to light them in my room at college. I heard what sounded like a cough, so I instantly stopped my music and started looking around. I didn't see anything, but I'm an extremely paranoid person, so I'm still very on edge, even though everything seems fine. I just sit there doing nothing for maybe 1 or 2 minutes, and I start settling back down, thinking maybe the cough was just leaves in the nearby woods. So I'm almost fully relaxed, but then I hear the cough again. Then I see something sprint on its back legs across the field faster than I've ever seen anything move before, and it gets to the other end of the field and then continues to stand there on its hind legs. I couldn't see it super well because it was dark and far away. Since I had just heard coughing and it was running on 2 legs, I initially thought it was a person, but when it was standing still, I could see that it was too large and weirdly proportioned to be human. It was also screeching the whole time, like an incredibly loud horror movie creature screeching that made my ears ring. It looked like its back was to me, so I took the opportunity to pack up and sprint home. I'm physically disabled and I can move around just fine, but never very quickly. I literally cannot think of another time in my life where I ever ran so fast. The only sort of paranormal thing I believe in is plain old ghosts, so as soon as I got home, I texted all my friends about it and Googled all I could. Everyone I texted reassured me that it was probably just injured or diseased, since that can make a deer act weird like that. So that's a little reassuring, but at the same time, I'm Googling about deer running on their hind legs and screeching their heads off, and while it's a decently documented occurrence, none of the pictures or videos on any website are anywhere near what I saw. 2 additional details. I am just assuming it was a deer based on its size. It didn't have antlers or anything. I couldn't really tell what it was, and I'm mainly going with deer because I'm very skeptical about paranormal topics, and I don't just want to assume it was anything other than a deer. I've read descriptions of deer running on their hind legs and watched videos of it, none of the videos I've seen really match up with just how strangely fast this thing was moving, like it was basically a blur running past me. Whether it was a not deer or something else, I'll let you decide. It did run on its hind legs and scream, which is something some people report with not deer encounters, but at the same time, there are plenty of other creatures that run on their hind legs and scream. A terrifying experience, nonetheless. So what are these people experiencing? Well, let's explore a few theories. There is a story that several indigenous tribes in North America share called the Deer Woman. I don't necessarily think this is a great fit, but it is an interesting story that's worth mentioning. Keep in mind, I am simplifying the story quite a bit here. The point of the story is to reinforce the importance of relationships, fertility, family, and other things of that nature. The Deer Woman sometimes appears entirely as a deer, other times with only the lower half of a deer, and according to some reports, she doesn't appear like a deer at all. In most versions of the story, she's attempting to entice men away from their families, and if the man fails to notice her hooves, then he falls under her spell forever. Again, I am oversimplifying the story, and I definitely recommend checking it out for yourself. A pair of theories a lot of people like to bring up, of course, is the Wendigo and the Skinwalker. If you're familiar with the online cryptid and paranormal communities, you'll know that it has become a fad to blame anything and everything strange on either Wendigos or Skinwalkers. It seems many people don't know the difference. For the uninitiated, Wendigos in popular depictions are humans that have resorted to cannibalism for survival. This corrupts the person, and in some stories, they develop an insatiable appetite, with every meal increasing its size and hunger. Ojibwe teacher and scholar Basil Johnston described Wendigos as tall but very thin, almost emaciated. It has a gray complexion, very skeleton-like, and smells incredibly bad. Here's why many people like to think not deer can be explained by Wendigos. In popular culture, Wendigos are often depicted as having antlers or other animal features, and appearing more animal-like in general. However, as far as I understand it, the animal-like depictions don't appear in the original stories. They're a modern addition. Skinwalkers, on the other hand, are a Navajo legend. They're described as witches that have the ability to disguise themselves as animals and use their supernatural abilities to cause harm to others. That sure sounds like a possibility to me. Now, for one of my favorite theories, the Fae, or Little People as they're referred to in Native American legends. I have always been fascinated by stories of the Fae. I love how every culture across the earth seems to have stories of the Fae, and it really seems like they're all reporting similar things. They might be reporting the same beings. Interestingly enough, while doing research for this podcast, I found a Scottish Redditor who says they have a similar phenomenon to not deer in Scotland, but it's attributed to the Fae, and it's called Fae cattle rather than not deer. The Redditor, who goes by Dr. Rocco Basilisk, was kind enough to let me share his post on the show. Here's what he had to say. We don't call it not deer. We call them fae or fairy cattle. Deer that are somehow uncanny, ethereal. They have the same sense of being off, strange in ways difficult to pinpoint. They seem too bold and fearless and have a watchful, intelligent, evaluating kind of stare. In Scotland, we have several deer species, including red, which is a big deer, and roe, which is a smaller, more delicate deer. The Fae can resemble either of these. Some people say they can talk, that either they imitate human speech or that they just leave you with the feeling or memory of them speaking without it going through your ears first. I've never heard of them being aggressive, though. They're more upsetting and intimidating. But we do have a cultural tradition of behaving with careful respect to anything fae, since they're known to be unpredictable and fickle. I have heard of people feeding them to placate them. People will leave apples or carrots on paths where they've been seen. I've never seen one myself, at least I don't think so. I have seen plenty of deer. Only once did I see one that acted strangely. A small herd bolted one time when I was out, but one slowly turned its head and stared for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than a minute. I got a vibe of kind of disdain. It snorted, stamped a foot, and then very slowly walked off in the direction the rest ran. But it stared at me and my dog the entire time, like we had rudely intruded and interrupted it. I've heard of fey cattle with red or white-tipped ears and legs, with oddly human eyes, or being seen dancing by standing on its hind legs and gesturing with forelimbs like they're doing sign language or some kind of ceremonial dance. I've not seen anything that odd myself, but I have spoken to people who have. I really love that story, and it definitely caused me to go down a fae rabbit hole. There are stories of the fae imitating animals. In most cases, the fae seem to ignore people and are benevolent. Other times, they might try to draw you out into the woods and cause you to become lost, make you lose your mind, or possibly even abduct you. In other cases, they might help you out if you're lost. I could see it being in the realm of the fae. The last out there theory I want to bring up is the idea that perhaps these entities are just egregores, beings created by our own minds. I do think our minds are powerful, and I don't think it's out of the question, in the same kind of way that placebos work. I think it's possible someone's mind was a little too creative. Maybe they had an experience with something they dreamed up that terrified them. They told people about it, and it raised the idea of that entity up into the collective consciousness. Not deer have certainly become a cryptid people like to talk about, and that just gives it more and more power. The more people that truly believe in something, the higher the chance an egregore is created. I think this has probably happened in many cases with various entities. All right, I'm sure some of you have already been waiting for this next theory. It's the last theory and certainly the most down-to-earth. It's chronic wasting disease, or some other disease affecting the health of the deer and just causing it to act funny. Chronic wasting disease is a prion disease that affects moose, elk, and deer. Animals experiencing the disease will lose weight, stumble around, drool, lose their fear of people, and experience other various neurological disorders. Plus, deer can stand up on their hind legs. They don't have to be not deer to do that, although typically it is only when a pair of bucks are fighting. I don't think that means deer have the ability to walk or run any sort of long distance on their hind legs. With that in mind, though, it wouldn't surprise me if a deer suffering from chronic wasting disease was doing some very weird things on its hind legs. And it does certainly sound like some of the reports of not deer. So what do I think? Well, I have no doubt that some not deer experiences are cases of chronic wasting disease. That would not surprise me at all. However, I like to believe there's more going on than just that. I think many paranormal experiences, including the fae, not deer, aliens, ghosts, cryptids, and some religious experiences are probably all the same type of beings behind the veil. That being ultra-terrestrials or interdimensional beings. Entities that live among us, but on a different plane of existence. One of Jacques Vallée's theories is that these beings act as kind of a control system for humanity. That certainly doesn't mean they all exist for the benefit of humanity. I think they're probably like humans in the sense that there are some with a mission to make the world better, to help humans evolve spiritually, to understand things at a deeper level, to leave things better than when we got here. At the same time, I think some of these beings are probably indifferent, while others might like to mess around with us, and still others could be described as evil. I think there's definitely more going on than we can perceive, and I would love to cover more of that theory by Jacques Vallée in a future episode. Thank you all for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, please rate and review and share it with your friends. It really does help. If you have a story that you would like shared in a future episode, just write it out or record it and send it to the email in the description. Until next week, I'm Easton Sanders, and this is Liminal Journeys.